Hey, what's up, everyone? This is Rick from Brunson20.com. Today we're going to look at another Gospel Doctrine lesson. It's going to be Lesson 5 from the Book of Mormon Manual, covering 1 Nephi 16 through 22, where Lehi takes his family and journeys through the wilderness to the Promised Land. So the first thing I wanted to mention before we get started is that a lot of the information I'm going to present in this video can also be found in a documentary called Journey of Faith, put on by Nili Maxitude Institute of Religious Scholarship. Really fantastic documentary, and covering a lot of the same events, a lot of the same information. So I'll put a link to that below the video as well. So with that, let's get started. If you remember back to Lesson 2, Lehi took his family. It says he traveled into the wilderness to the borders of the Red Sea, and from the borders of the Red Sea, they went 3 days' journey into the wilderness. And we know that they were kind of staying close to the Red Sea during their journey. So this would have put them at a place called Wadi Tayyib al-Izm, and this is the best candidate for the Valley of Lemuel, which we covered last time. Here, of course, you can see the valley and the river that runs between it that flows continuously into the Red Sea. And this was their camp for a while. This is where they sent Nephi back to get the plates, and also to get Ishmael's family on a second occasion. But this is where they're making camp through that time. So the word comes from the Lord that Lehi should take his family and depart into the wilderness. And in the morning, they open their door and they find a ball of curious workmanship, which of course we know to be the Liahona. And so I wanted to talk about this Liahona briefly. It's interesting that if you think about the Liahona, it had some pointers or spindles in it, but because of the nature of the Liahona, they would have always had to have been pointing in some direction at all times. Even during those times of unrighteousness, these pointers would still been pointing in some direction. So the question is, how did you know if it was working or not? How did you know if whatever direction the Liahona was pointing in, if that was the direction the Lord wanted you to go? And this is interesting. For example, Nephi is in the middle of the ocean, and he looks down at the Liahona and panics because it stopped working. He says it did cease to work. And now how would he know? He's in the middle of the ocean. How would he know whatever direction the Liahona was pointing, that wasn't the direction the Lord wanted them to go? Nephi apparently knew something that we don't about the Liahona, because he knew that it wasn't working. And the question is, how did he know? The pointers would have still been pointing in some direction at all times, even when they are being unrighteous, as in the case of on the ship. So that's the question. And one possible explanation, there could be a few, but one possible explanation is we have to remember that the Liahona had not one but two spindles inside of it. And if you think about that, this means that the only way that you could be true to both spindles and follow both of them was if they were aligned together. So if there was ever a time when they weren't in agreement with each other, when they were pointing in opposite directions, you could not follow both. You could only follow both when they were aligned and unified in the direction they were pointing. So this could be the purpose for this second spindle. For example, we've heard this phrase, "In the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses shall every word be established." And it appears that this principle holds true with the Liahona as well. That the purpose of the second spindle was to be a second witness, to let Lehi's party know that the direction it was pointing in could be trusted. And when they're aligned, it can be trusted. When they are not aligned, you cannot follow both. And you can get lost that way. So that's one possible answer. And by the way, this was written up in an article published in the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies in 1994. There's the reference if any of you want to chase that down. And I'll put a link to the article I wrote on the Liahona as well that will give a little bit more information on those spindles. Now, after Lehi gets to Liahona, it says they departed into the wilderness. And Nephi tells us that they went 4 days into the wilderness, traveling in a south-southeast direction. And it says that we did pitch our tents again, and we did call the name of the place Shays ER. So the thing I wanted to point out is that Nephi tells us that they were the ones who named the place Shays ER. It wasn't a place that the locals had already named Shays ER, but rather Nephi was the one that named it Shays ER, him and his family. So that will be important to remember as we progress through their journey. I'll show you why here in a minute. But that would have put them, 4-day journey in a south-southeast direction would have put them in this region here, if you reference the map, at a place called Wadi Akar. And it's interesting, if we look at the word Shays ER, why did Nephi name this place Shays ER? Well, Shays ER, Hugh Nibley did some research a while back, and he said that Shays ER had two meanings. It meant trees and it meant water. And so a good translation for Shays ER would be trees by water, or an oasis of some sort. So that Nephi was probably naming it Shays ER because of the scenery around it. So when looking for a possible candidate for Shays ER, we should look for a place that has trees by water. Another qualification is that Nephi tells us that he went into the nearby wilderness to slave food for their families. So there has to be animals to hunt nearby, wild game, that sort of thing, that they could slave food and provide for their families. So if we look at this Wadi Akar area, this is the best candidate for Shays ER. As you can see by the picture, there's lots of trees which are by water, and as it turns out, this has one of the best places to hunt in all of Arabia. So this area really fits the description of the Book of Mormon really well, and is in all probability the likely location of Shays ER here. So after they camp at Shays ER, they travel again into the wilderness, and Nephi says, and after we had traveled for the space of many days, we did pitch our tents for the space of a time, that we might again rest ourselves and obtain food for our families. So if you notice the way that Lehi and his family are traveling through the wilderness, they camp for a time and travel for the space of 3 or 4 days, and then camp for another, it says space of a time. Could be weeks, could be months, and then make their next journey into the wilderness for another 3 or 4 days. And if we look at this statement by Hugh Nibley, he says, Lehi's party is described as moving through the desert for a few days, 3 or 4 one would estimate, and then camping for the space of a time. This is exactly the way the Arabs move. And the reason why they move this way is because in the desert, of course, there aren't a lot of places to get water, to get resources, food, that sort of thing. And so whenever you can find water, that's where you have to go, and you have to push through 3 or 4 days journey until you get there. And as soon as you get there, you can camp, rest, get some food, and prepare for the next leg of the journey. So interesting comment by Hugh Nibley there. Okay, and the next place where they're camping at, this is where Nephi breaks his bow, which was made of fine steel. And the only thing I wanted to mention about this bow, this steel bow, is another statement by Hugh Nibley. He said, a steel bow was not necessarily a solid piece of metal any more than the Canaanites' chariot of iron were solid iron. It was in all probability a steel-ribbed bow. And those steel-ribbed bows were commonly used at this time in ancient Palestine. So something worth mentioning. So Nephi, after his bow breaks, he makes a new bow and makes a stick. Makes an arrow out of a stick. And again, I wanted to point out this comment by Hugh Nibley. He said, according to the ancient Arab writers, The only bow-wood obtainable in all Arabia was the nab-wood that grew only amid the inaccessible and overhanging cliffs of Mount Jasum and Mount Azd, which are situated in the very region where, if we follow the Book of Mormon, the broken bow incident occurred. Another striking similarity there between Nephi's record and the geography in Arabia, where there's bow-wood available as they travel through this area. Okay, now they leave this camp of the broken bow, and the next place they come to will be Nahom. In verse 34, if you look down to verse 34, it says, "And it came to pass that Ishmael died and was buried in the place which was called Nahom." Now, if you remember back to Shays ER, Lehi and his families were the ones who named that area Shays ER. But not so with Nahom. That's not what Nephi says. It says that they brought Ishmael to a place which was called Nahom. They weren't the ones that named this place Nahom. This was apparently a place that already existed and was already being called Nahom by the locals. As we look at this map here, as we follow their journey, this sort of put them down in this area. And in 1994, archaeologists started doing some digging in this region, and they were able to dig up several temples. And one of the here's a picture of the altar on one of these temples, and right there is the word Nahom inscribed on the altar. So we're finding that this region was well known to people anciently, 600 BC, and that this was an area being called Nahom by the locals. So this is a great find for the Book of Mormon. Another thing I wanted to point out is that Ishmael was buried here at this place, and this is interesting because we're finding that this ancient place of Nahom was an ancient burial ground that the locals used to bury their dead. They brought them to this place. If we look at the statement by Mark Johnson, he says, "I feel that it is most likely that Ishmael died well before the Lehites arrived at Nahom, possibly weeks or even months before. Hugh Nibley points out that it is not uncommon for desert people to carry their dead many miles to locate the proper place of burial. And just as the bones of Joseph were brought up out of Egypt and buried in Shechem, it only seems natural that the Lehites would wait until they found a proper place to bury Ishmael." He continues, "The place of Nahom is a few miles off the main incense trail that Lehi took. It is unlikely that they would go out of their way unless it was rather important. Surely a death of a loved one would qualify. Nahom already existed and was already a place of burial. The chances seem slim that Ishmael would die as the party arrived at Nahom. The logical conclusion is that Ishmael died along the way and was carried to Nahom." So an interesting observation there by Mark Johnson, and of course there's a reference there published in the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies, if you want to track that down. So now after Nahom, it said that we did again take our journey into the wilderness, and we did travel nearly eastward from that time forth. Now, if we look at this map, Lehi, of course, was traveling an ancient trade route called the Incense Trail or the Frankincense Trail. And all the roads through this area would have led to a city called Marab. And Marab was a city that was in existence. It probably was one of the largest cities that Lehi's family would have passed through along their journey. And it's interesting to think of Lehi and Nephi encountering people as they travel through the desert. Of course, we're usually not accustomed to thinking of that when we read the text of the Book of Mormon. But as we learn more about this ancient frankincense incense trail, learn more about the geography in this area, 600 BC, we discover that it was very likely that Lehi and his family would have encountered people along their journey. They would have passed through cities such as Marab to get supplies that sort of thing, and most definitely would have encountered people. Up near Jerusalem, they probably would have wanted to hide out a little bit and lay low, but not so much out here in the desert. They were much safer from the political situation up at Jerusalem. They probably would have felt much more comfortable to interact with people. Now, I bring this up, and I wanted to shift gears for a minute and talk about the wise men. We've been talking about Arabia and this route that Lehi took through Arabia. And I wanted to pose the question of, where did the wise men come from? There's lots of theories out there, Persia being one, Babylon, that sort of thing. But those areas don't fit for a couple reasons for me, but there is a region that fits very nicely in my opinion, and that is Arabia. So I wanted to pose the question of, did the wise men come from Arabia? Did they come from this area that Lehi traveled through? Now, of course, the New Testament tells us the wise men came from the east. And this phrase is interesting and important because to the east, to those in Jerusalem, when you reference the east, that usually, if not always, meant Arabia, so that's reason number one. Another good reason why the wise men could have come from this area of Arabia is that the wise men followed a star. So they knew stellar navigation, and it's interesting that the Arabs were among the first to use stellar navigation. They were using it even before sailors. Of course, they were using it to navigate through the desert. So they were experts in stellar navigation. So that fits as well. It's interesting that the wise men brought frankincense and myrrh, and one of the exclusive place to get frankincense and myrrh was in Arabia. That is this trail route, this ancient trade route that we've been talking about, this frankincense trail. This was the path that the people in Arabia took to trade their frankincense and myrrh to the upper Mediterranean world. So this is where it came from, and so it's very fitting that frankincense and myrrh were brought by the wise men to Christ. So that's another reason why it's possible the wise men came from this area. It's also interesting that the wise men brought gold with them. Now, southern Arabia traded their frankincense with India for gold, making Arabia one of the most wealthiest places in the world at this time. So they had lots of gold in abundance, and it would have been easy for the wise men to bring gold as well. So that fits. It's interesting that according to the Bible dictionary, it says that the wise men were representatives of a branch of the Lord's people. And most of the Arabs in this area were Hebrews. So that would fit as well, the Bible dictionary. Now, if this is true, if the wise men did come from this area, we have to ask the question, how did the wise men learn of Christ? How did they learn of his birth? If you think back to the New Testament, it's interesting that there's no mention of an angel appearing to the wise men, unlike the shepherds. The gospel writers are quick to point out that an angel appeared to the shepherds to tell them about the birth of the Christ child, but there's no mention of angels appearing to the wise men. That certainly would have been a detail that would have been included had that happened. So it's also interesting that in Matthew chapter 2, it said that once they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. So this lets us know that they had probably been waiting quite some time for this star to appear, because when it finally appeared, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. So something that they had been looking for quite some time. So this tells us that they most likely learned it from the oral and written traditions of their forefathers. This was probably something that had been passed down from generation to generation, about this star being born that would signal the birth of the Messiah. Now I bring this up to pose this question. is it possible that the Arabs received this knowledge from Lehi? That's an interesting question. If we look at 1 Nephi chapter 10, verse 4, this is what Nephi says. It says, "Yea, even 600 years from the time that my father left Jerusalem, a prophet would the Lord God raise up among the Jews, even a Messiah, or in other words, a Savior of the world." So Nephi and Lehi knew the exact year that the Messiah would be born. So they definitely had that information that they could have passed on as they traveled through this area. And we've already mentioned that Lehi would have encountered people along this journey, and it's only natural that Lehi and Nephi, being prophets of God, would have taught the gospel along their journey to anyone that would have listened. And of course, part of that is the birth of the Savior. And it's interesting that Lehi, we learn this from 1 Nephi chapter 10, verse 4, knew that Christ would be born among the Jews. So he not only knew the year, he also knew that he would be born among the Jews. Now this is interesting because the wise men did not know where to find Jesus when they went to Jerusalem, other than all they knew that he was at Jerusalem. They knew that he was among the Jews. So just like Lehi didn't really have any specific information as to where exactly Christ would be born. All he knew is that it would be among the Jews. That's really all the wise men knew as well. So that's possible that they could have got that information from Lehi. And it's also interesting that Nephi, while they're in the valley of Lemuel, Nephi saw a child born to Mary, during a vision, and so this would have been fresh on his mind. And of course, Nephi knew exactly when this child would be born. And it's also interesting that Nephites knew about the new star. Samuel the Lamanite knew about this new star. Now, whether he received that from revelation on the wall, or perhaps he had it from the scriptures from Lehi, we don't know. But it's interesting that the Nephites knew that a new star would appear. Nephi saw a child being born. They knew exactly when this child would be born and approximately where, and that's the information that the Arabs had, or I should say the wise men had, when they came to find Christ. So, and by the way, this particular information, this comes from an article by George Potter called "Does the Book of Mormon Solve a Christmas Mystery?" Published in Meridian Magazine back in 2006. So that's a really interesting article if you want to learn more about that and get some of those references. So back to Lehi. After Nahum, he says they did travel in a nearly eastward direction from that time forth. So before this time, they were traveling in a south-southeast direction until Nahum. Then they start to curve around and travel eastward. Now, this would have been the most difficult stretch of their journey, this eastward direction, because this would have taken them through Arabia's empty quarter, this desert. It gets very hot. As you can see, there's hardly any vegetation there. It can get up to 125 degrees. Really miserable experience. There could be sandstorms, a whole bunch of terrible things. Just a really miserable stretch of the journey for Lehi and his family. But this is what Nephi says. It said, "And so great were the blessings of the Lord upon us, that we did live upon raw meat in the wilderness. For the Lord had not hitherto suffered that we should make much fire as we journey in the wilderness. For he said, I will make thy food become sweet, that you cook it not." So Nephi makes a point to tell us that they didn't have to cook their food at this stretch of the journey because the Lord didn't want them to make fire. Now that's interesting, and you have to ask, why not? Why didn't they just make fire to cook their food? And the answer is that this stretch of their journey was very dangerous. The other part of their journey wasn't quite as dangerous. But look at what Hugh Nibley says. He says, Lehi's party were trespassers wherever they walked. Speaking of this particular part of their journey. Every inch of the desert is claimed by some tribe or another that will demand the life of a trespasser. They never dared build a fire on the open plain where it would attract the attention of a prowling raiding party over long distances and invite a night attack. So, dangerous place. You don't want to draw attention to yourself, where you can be robbed or killed, that sort of thing. So they didn't make fire during this stretch of their journey. Of course, the Lord fed them miraculously. Now, if we look at this satellite photograph, you can see they're traveling through this desert to this patch of green. This would have been the place where they're going. This would have been bountiful. This is the region of Oman and the Dhofar region. So here's a picture of this bountiful. As you can see, it's very green, and this particular area fits very nicely the text of the Book of Mormon. All the requirements mention of the Book of Mormon we find at this place. I'll just quickly move through these. Of course, bountiful. This was nearly eastward from Nahum. It was along the seashore. There you can see the seashore there. Nephi tells us that it had a wide variety of fruits, and of course, lots of fruits in this area. Nephi tells us that it had wild honey. There's a picture of lots of bees in the area. There was a mountain nearby where Nephi went to pray. Lots of mountains in this region that would have been an easy climb for Nephi. Nephi tells us that there was ore available. Here you can see ore deposits just coming to the surface of these rocks, making it very easy for Nephi to get ore, to make tools. Nephi tells us that there were stones available to make fire, which this place has. He says that there were beasts, there's animals where they could get skins to make bellows, and there was meat from the wilderness available. Of course, lots of animals they could have hunted in this area as well. Nephi also tells us that there was plenty of materials to build and sell a ship. And what you're looking at here is something called an umbrella tree. And there's a whole forest of this in this area. This would have been perfect for shipbuilding, very strong, very buoyant type of wood. Of course, this place needed to have a harbor to build and launch a ship. And there's a few different candidates for the harbor that Nephi would have used, possibly. Nephi tells us that there were cliffs directly above deep water. We know this because Laman and Lemuel wanted to throw him off these cliffs and kill him at one point. So there's some of the cliffs there associated with this terrain. So from there, if you look at this map that I quickly drew up, so here we have Bountiful, the place where Lehi and Nephi would have departed in their ship. And this is the likely route that they took. They probably stayed close to the shore when they could. And in fact, let me show you this quote by Kelly DeVries. It said, Nephi no doubt kept close to the shore when he could. This was not something that was just tradition among shippers. This was used for safety and also used for resupply purposes. John Sorensen said, did they stop on the way? Surely. Why go without water when you can go ashore and get it? And on the second occasion, John Sorensen said, since boats routinely had to be beached for repairs after storms or to have their bottoms scraped or to await favorable winds, it is reasonable to assume that Lehi's party would have stopped from time to time on their journey along the coastline and through the Pacific Isles. So if we return to this map here, of course, this was probably the likely route that Lehi would have taken. And of course, he can stay close to the shore through much of the first half of the journey, and then at about the second half, he'll have to make that long jump towards the New World, to where they landed in likely Mesoamerica, in my opinion. So that's the lesson for today. Don't forget to check out my website, brunson20.com. Thanks for joining us.